everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, Oliver. If you don't mind, I'll start by lavishing a little praise on you before I let you speak. For those of you who don't know Oliver, he's assistant editor at New Left Review, where he edits the excellent blog Sidecar. If you want something great in your inbox every week, I really recommend that you subscribe to that newsletter. He's also a regular contributor to Novara Media, and he writes on culture and politics for The Guardian, the TLS, and the Literary Review. Now, you may or may not know that the Starmer Project, here's my product placement, is his first book. It's written for Verso. And if you're wondering for early reviews, we've learned from the Telegraph today that it's a, quote, sneering biography laced with bitterness and clouded by bias. If you want to know a little more about what the book is about, let's think about what the man himself has said about it. Oliver says about the subject that Starmer's mission is to extinguish his predecessor's legacy by policing the boundaries of acceptable opinion in the party and punishing those who transgress them. As former chief prosecutor, he's ideally suited to this role. So that gives you a hint, along with the Telegraph mini review, of what you can expect. One thing that struck me when I looked at the book was how useful it was to see the Starmer Project divided up into 4 key sections: the lawyer, the politician, the candidate, and the leader. And this is where the description, the government's punisher-in-chief, comes in. I found it particularly informative, Oliver, that you spent so much time looking at his time in the Crown Prosecution Service, his close work with Barack Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder, and traveling around the world on behalf of the government here, and his time as DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions. That's following that he was knighted, and where he garnered the respect of conservative politicians such as the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve. In fact, you mentioned that when Ed Miliband was thinking of Starmer running as a candidate, Grieve gave him the big thumbs up. You've said that as DPP, he acted as a Cameron Osborne mouthpiece on issues from welfare entitlements to public order. The other thing I would say, and that I found super useful in the book, was that we get to read about Starmer in relation to a number of names that will be familiar to the people in this audience: Julian Assange, Binyam Mohammed, Ian Tomlinson, Jean-Charles de Menezes, Mark Duggan, not all of them dead. And they appear along with issues about spy cops, the 24-hour courts following the 2011 riots, and decisions to prosecute women for making allegations of rape and domestic violence. There's a lot to take in here in a very short book. So, Oliver, why did you write this book?
That's a very fair question, Karen. Yeah, I don't know why anyone in their right mind would want to spend a year with Sir Keir as I did. But I suppose it was initially the result of a very short Verso blog post that I wrote back in January 2020 during the Labour leadership election, where I was quite surprised by the number of kind of vaguely momentum aligned people who I'd canvassed with in 2019, who then seemed to be kind of won over by Starmer's leadership pitch, and seemed to believe his 10 pledges and think that he was going to deliver on them. And it therefore seemed necessary just to offer some kind of mild rejoinder to that, even just a sort of 500-word one, summing up some of the things that you just mentioned that he did as Director of Public Prosecutions, and using these to just cast some aspersions on what Starmer claimed to represent. So I guess I wrote this little blog post, and then a few months later, the kind of retrospectives on Corbynism started coming out. You had the 2 Times journalists writing Left Out, and then after that you had Owen Jones's This Land. And I guess it struck me from those accounts of the Corbyn experiment that there had been a certain kind of change in the ideological weather particularly after the catastrophic 2019 defeat, but also I think in the run-up to it, which kind of really laid the groundwork for Starmer's takeover of the party. And it seemed to me that by putting, I don't know, the narrative of those books in dialogue with sort of what I experienced firsthand, which was people who considered themselves very much on the left, then kind of, opting for Starmer over the supposed Corbynite continuity candidate. It seemed like there was a kind of historical sort of process to draw out there, and that Starmer was sort of a metonym for broader changes going on in Labour Party politics. And so that seemed kind of like a story worth telling. And it was at that very moment, actually, that I just got an email from the kind of Verso upper echelon saying, would you be interested in turning the blog post of yours into a political biography? So with great reluctance, I then, embarked on a round of interviews, both with kind of senior lawyers and bureaucrats in the Crown Prosecution Service who worked with Starmer there, and also with shadow cabinet members during the Corbyn years, and senior staffers who witnessed the whole Brexit saga firsthand and were able to give an account of Starmer's role in it. So not necessarily the project I would have wanted to take on, but felt like it was worth doing, and I was also sort of given it as an assignment.
When you write a nonfiction book, there's sort of two approaches. One is, here's some stuff I know and I want to tell you about it, and then there's on the other side, here's some things I'd like to find out, and I'll probably tell you when I do. Where would you say this book sits? How much of it did you know already? How much work did you have to do?
Well, I guess there was the stuff that was simply a matter of public record about his DPP tenure, which I had researched when writing that initial article. And so I suppose that gave me the general orientation, which was, Starmer's self-presentation does not necessarily match the reality, and that's and the reality is probably worth digging into further. I had that sort of basic sense just from the research I'd done before I started writing the book, but then I guess there was a lot that one had to understand, both about how the CPS operates as an institution in order to understand Starmer's role in it. And then in the more political chapters, there's a huge amount of material that's really omitted from all the books that have been published about Brexit so far, which could only be excavated through doing these kind of first-hand interviews. I guess the point of that section of the book is really to very closely chart the evolution of Labour's Brexit position, almost kind of month by month, from 2016 to 2019. And all the books that have been written so far about Corbynism or about Brexit are kind of, in a way, too panoramic, focusing on like too many other factors, like the sort of anti-Semitism crisis, or like, other aspects of the party's program, and not able to give that kind of laser-like focus on how that process unfolded. So that was something that certainly took a lot of work, all of it conducted sort of over Zoom in the middle of the pandemic.
Well, it's better than gardening or queuing up for a toilet roll. I guess this is obviously a moving picture, right? I got my uncorrected page proof some months ago, and things keep happening. When you're writing about something that is not 5,000 years ago, it's always annoying to go, damn, I wish I could have got that in there. What's happened since you went, I'm done, that that would have nuanced the picture, or maybe there'll be some follow-up blogs or a second edition, or is it pretty much more of the same?
Well, I guess I tried to, being aware that I was sort of tracking a moving target, I tried to make the final section about the leadership less of a kind of chronological account and more of a thematic one, sort of trying to anatomize the Starmer Project and say what are its themes, what are its core components, rather than sort of telling it as a story from when he gets elected to, the present. But I suppose the major thing that's happened since the book came out is the war in Ukraine, and seeing Starmer's response to that, I suppose, confirms some of what's in the book already, just about his line being so kind of ultra hawkish, being about being willing to go further than the Tories would in arming the Ukrainians, in applying broad sanctions to Russia, and in sort of targeting oligarchs' wealth, which, whether or not you agree with those positions, it's certainly a shift back towards the kind of Atlanticist norms of the Blair years and away from the Corbynite position, which is sort of de-escalatory and diplomatic rather than militarist. So I suppose that's a major thing. And then also the kind of never-ending provocations to the Labour left, which have stepped up another gear in tandem with the war in Ukraine, obviously threatening to withdraw the whip from the dissident MPs who signed the Stop the War Coalition letter. That seems like it's the beginning of a potentially quite significant trend, where I think you're going to have, a whole number of issues on which Starmer decides to concoct a kind of confrontation with the MPs who he wants to get rid of, and then he'll either force them to kind of ritually humiliate themselves and toe the party line, or he'll remove the whip, but do so on his own terms, on issues that are the most kind of propitious for the leadership. So I think now the Labour left, particularly, even more so than when I wrote this book, is locked in this kind of death spiral, and has very few institutions or allies within the party itself to draw on. So that's another thing that I suppose I would have covered and have done a bit since in other pieces of journalism.
Right. When you were researching for this book, when you were writing it, what did you learn that surprised you about Starmer, about the people around him, whether it's donations, the sort of fine-grained detail of what went on in the CPS?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think that there's a sort of tendency to dismiss Starmer as completely cynical. And the book, in a way, kind of really rails against that, because it tries to show that he does have a fairly consistent politics that can be traced back, at least as far as his CPS days, if not further. And so I guess I'm opposed to the idea, and I was when I started writing the book, that Starmer is simply a kind of empty vessel, a chameleon who is a conduit for other people's influences and doesn't have a kind of ideological center of his own. And I think I do stand by that diagnosis. But maybe what surprised me was that there's a difference between kind of cynicism and mendacity. And while Starmer may not be particularly cynical in that he has like real, clear beliefs and convictions, he can be extremely mendacious and economical with the truth. And that his Labour leadership campaign, which famously was built on the great lie of the 10 pledges, that actually has a much longer history, and there are various moments throughout his time at the CPS when he sort of similarly quite brazenly distorts the truth in order to sort of, glorify himself or in order to win favor with the media. So just one example that springs to mind, I suppose, is about his handling of the London riots, where there was quite a prominent Guardian write-up in the aftermath of those disturbances in 2011, where the headline was something like rapid sentencing better than, severe punishments, says Starmer. So Starmer was trying to create the impression that his response to the riots was quite a kind of humane one, that was about using sort of, rapid prosecution as a form of deterrence, but not necessarily handing down really disproportionate punishments to people who stole bottles of water or whatever. And this was reported kind of completely uncritically at the time. But actually, if you look at what the CPS did in response to the riots, it was not only trying to increase the rate of sentencing by, as you said earlier, holding these all-night court sittings where, conveyor belt justice was meted out to sort of teenagers who were dragged before the Crown courts. Also, Starmer took measures to actually increase the sentences that people were given, sometimes by changing the venue where the cases were heard, or by slapping charges of burglary onto crimes that would otherwise be prosecuted as much more minor, sort of non-carceral offenses. So just, just kind of the brazenness of some of those sort of lines that he fed to the media was quite striking when kind of confronted with the actual documentary evidence.
It's been a common criticism of Starmer by people on the left when initiatives such as speaking to the public with some large flags behind him, that he's a creature who's following focus groups and thinking we can get the red wall back by looking patriotic. So he's dismissed in that way as being someone who says, well, I'll give you my opinion after we have a focus group. So what you're arguing is that what some people have called flag shagging, the kind of blue Labour idea of country and so on, is actually not a focus group decision, but that's how he rolls. That's your argument. I think so, and I do think that that it can be traced back to earlier parts of his biography. Although that's not then to diminish the importance of focus groups in the Starmer Project, which does have this kind of this firm belief in certain quasi-scientific methods of measuring public opinion and then sort of parroting it back in the sound bites that the party puts out. I think there are probably two elements of Starmerism to sort of distinguish there. One is its kind of disciplinary logic, which you mentioned in the introduction, that Starmerism is really to a large extent about kind of ensuring that Corbynism cannot recur, and ensuring that the elements within the party that are its inheritors and legatees are effectively silenced and marginalized. So there's that kind of incredibly negative valence to the Starmer Project that's all about sort of denial and repression. And that's something that, as I argue, he was sort of well trained in as the country's chief prosecutor. But at the same time, I think there is an awareness, not just among Starmer, but also among his senior staffers, that that's not a very compelling public platform, kind of simply saying no. Discipline and punish.
Discipline and punish, while it might be effective inside the party to kind of quash the legacy of Corbynism, the country is more than the party, and they need to have some kind of pitch to the public as well. So I think that's where the focus groups come in. I think, as well as turning the party into this kind of disciplinary apparatus, it's also become a kind of comms machine that tries using methods like focus groups or listening exercises or public consultations to kind of get what some of Starmer's staffers would call the core values of the British public in focus, and then craft a message that resonates with them. So I think it's an incredibly kind of shallow form of politics, and it clearly hasn't worked, even though Starmer is sort of riding higher in the polls than ever before. Surveys still show that people have absolutely no idea what he thinks on any major policy question, which is a result of, just kind of mimicking back the sort of jumbled and self-contradictory views that he gets from people in focus groups. But I think, there are these two elements. There's the kind of very negative approach to Labour's internal culture, and then there's something resembling a positive pitch, but that can only come from these focus groups.
Can I just say, though, I mean, focus groups, of course, we all like to go, oh, that's what people in marketing do. But, to be fair, it's part and parcel of most political projects. And since you can't be on everyone's doorstep, is that not a reasonable way to find out what people are thinking? It happens in parties of all stripes.
I think there are effective variants of focus groups, and the great irony also is that when crafting the party's economic platform under the Corbyn leadership, John McDonnell and Rebecca Long Bailey went on these national tours where they did something that in a way resembles what Starmer has done, like actually sort of talking to people about the material problems that they're facing and finding out what might solve them. But I suppose that was used actually in the service of policy planning. Right. Whereas I guess why I said that the Starmer Project has remade the party as a comms machine is that really, for Claire Ainsley and the like, focus groups don't yield policies, they yield kind of buzzwords. Right. And they think that because, they have a fairly accurate understanding of how Labour has become kind of detached from its heartlands or its core constituencies since the 90s. But they think the way to sort of reconstitute their voter base is just to kind of keep repeating ad infinitum words like duty and family and responsibility. And I think that even if those are the words that come to people's minds in focus groups, I don't think that repeating them back does anything particularly effective. I think maybe, creating a policy platform that comes out of the problems people bring to public consultations is effective, but I think that's not really what Starmer is interested in. And indeed, there have been instances where, for example, he launched a big public consultation around environmental policy. Something like 75% of submissions said, we want you to adopt a Green New Deal. And of course he couldn't, because that falls outside the very narrow sphere of acceptable opinion that he is, so anxiously trying to guard.
You sort of make the case in the book that transformative leadership is more than just going, oh, what words do you mention when I ask you about stuff, and echoing it back, versus someone who perhaps is able to make people look at things differently. And certainly for those who, found inspiration from the Corbyn Project, that might have been the case. We've heard that you didn't want to join the gang doing the blow by blow by blow. Then this happened in the leader of the opposition's office. Oh, and what did Diane Abbott say then? Because of course you could spend a long time dissecting that, and others will. But I wondered if you had any other thoughts about what kind of book you didn't want to write, and maybe you could tell us your thoughts on the two Starmer books, your competitors in the market. One called Red Night, the unauthorized biography of Sir Keir Starmer, written by the head of Biteback Publishing, Lord Ashcroft, former deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, pollster and businessman. I'm not going to give any spoilers away about what he thinks, and then Nigel Cawthorne, who is at Sir Keir's grammar school. He wrote a book, Keir Starmer, the Reluctant Politician. Presumably you did not want to write books like that, especially since they'd already been done by Lord Ashcroft and Nigel, but
yes,
there's a tendency in biography of political figures to do kind of two-bit psychoanalysis. He did this because he believed that. Did you want to stay away from that?
Yes, I did want to stay away from that. I had been really, warded off that by the grim but necessary experience of reading those two biographies that you just mentioned. I was reluctant in the first place to write anything that might be described as a political biography, and I did a bit of wrangling with my editors about whether that would be put on the back cover. I think I ended up avoiding it and going instead for something like profile or portrait. But I think the reason for that is that, political biography can so easily descend into pop psychologizing or sort of backroom gossip. And, in a way, there are elements of this that are kind of journalistic, that are about deals that were struck or broken in Westminster during the Brexit years. And, that stuff just is important to understand how policies are made or changed. So there are elements of kind of reportage running through the book, but I think the reason why I wanted it to be a portrait is that I wanted to see Starmer as reflective of something broader. And I guess that thing was the kind of shifts in the ideological climate that brought him to power and that so quickly unraveled the influence of Corbyn's leadership. And so I think I was always concerned with, both kind of keeping Starmer in focus as a subject and offering a verdict on him as a character, as a bureaucrat, as a politician, but also not losing sight of the kind of historical context around him and how it's changed over the past sort of half decade.
All books have to be legaled. Is there a lot of legaling with this book?
There was a fair amount. I think we sent it to 2 law firms, both of which had to declare a conflict of interest because they had had previous dealings with Starmer. The world of kind of London lawyers is incredibly insular. Yeah. And Starmer is, looms large within it. And in a way, that was why it was sort of easy to get a lot of interviews because so many people have had contact with him and dealings with him. But yes, then eventually it was sent to a 3rd lawyer who was able to do it. And I was so thrilled and shocked that it came through unscathed, really. And it
wasn't originally 600 pages, you're saying?
And I cut out all the salacious details. No, I was shocked that she made like maybe 3 comments to like put in the word allegedly in different places, which I was very happy to do. But I felt, like I should have tried harder to be libelous or something. I was like failing in my responsibility somehow. But anyway, that for the next book.
So thinking about the campaign for leader of the opposition, you mentioned that Morgan McSweeney, the Labour Together guy, Blairite, who plays a key role in Starmer's leadership campaign, had a theory that the Labour Party membership includes, can be divided up into 3 chunks. 30% aligned with the left, they're always going to be that way. 30% on the right, always going to be that way. And then a kind of mushy 40% of idealists driven by vague moral principles who could be induced to vote for a Blairite candidate appealing to their ethical instincts. I mean, that sort of reproduces things that I think a lot of people saw in his campaign. Do you agree with McSweeney? Is that how he won?
I think to a large extent I do agree, and I think this kind of goes back to the question we raised earlier about when focus groups are and aren't effective. McSweeney was one of the people involved in the attempt to extinguish the Corbyn experiment in its early days with Owen Smith's campaign. And after that attempt failed, what his wing of the party did was decide, we're not going to waste our energy on another abortive attempt to unseat Corbyn. Instead, we're going to go away and regroup and do a huge amount of internal polling in order to really take the temperature of the party. And what that yielded, and I'm not the first person to write about this, this is also in Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire's book, but what that yielded was, this sense that you have the hard ideologues on either side, and then a constituency in the middle who are the most electorally significant, who are really sort of up for grabs. And I think that relates to another element of Starmer's leadership pitch that I talk about in the book, which is this idea of kind of moral socialism. Moral here being the implicit opposite of kind of ideological. So, we have our instincts are, of course, socialist, which then gives us license to have, the most hard right policies you can possibly imagine. I think by, tapping into that sense that a lot of Labour members didn't necessarily have the firmest ideological foundation, that they come from a whole tradition that, as many people who write for the journal that I work for, New Left Review, have explained, didn't have the same kind of socialist politics that many social democratic parties on the continent had, but was always a much more diffuse kind of Christianized socialism that was really inured against Marxism or against any kind of theoretical edifice that could support its politics. As a result, I think there always have been a large number of Labour members who can kind of lean in either direction, and who are susceptible to a compelling pitch like Starmer's. And I think that was something that McSweeney correctly identified, and then built a platform around. And I guess, so, that might be an example of kind of these polling exercises working out. I think what I then try to show is that that fed into the Starmer Project's kind of national strategy to then, say, we've done this for the Labour membership and it's worked, so we're just going to scale it up to Britain as a whole. And just as we sort of scientifically determined the values of the party faithful, we're going to do the same thing with the broader electorate. And I think that's where that really runs into problems, because it's kind of easier when a political party like Labour has a set of traditions and kind of distinctive elements of its politics that you can identify and then kind of mimic back. It's easier to do that than it is to sort of measure an incredibly complex kind of class differentiated nation as a whole and try to create one sort of unified, consistent set of value statements that speaks to it. I think that's a much more difficult operation.
There are a couple of words that come up often with Sir Keir. Of course, forensic, which I notice has managed to get on the back of your book. Extra points there. The other one that I heard a lot, and a lot of people did as well, is grown up. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about the continuing appeal of a plausible white man in a suit in terms of UK politics. For example, though, the fact that he held what were enormously significant senior grown-up roles, one that got him knighted. Would you say that one of the things in the leadership election was that people assumed that if he'd had such an important job, he had to know stuff and know better than us. When he spoke at Westminster North CLP just after he announced his candidacy for leader, in a speech where he said he was a socialist and had his 10 things and, you know, lots of great stuff, his working class background and so on, wanting a better Britain. The one time in that discussion where he was not at all pleasant and very quick to respond was when a supporter of Julian Assange raised the subject. And Starmer's reply was essentially, I've seen stuff, and if you've seen the papers I've seen, then you'd know, but I can't tell you, but it's a thing. And of course, for a lot of people who were not necessarily supporting Julian Assange or freedom of the press or unjust incarceration, that has a lot of salience, wouldn't you say? He had a big job and he saw stuff.
I absolutely agree, and I'm trying my very best not to ever write about Starmer again now that the book is done. But I did commit to doing a long essay for Salvage magazine, which is all about this theory of kind of grown-up politics, or really interrogating what mature politics means, at the present moment, sort of on the British left. And I think, sort of childishness in a way can be conceived as like a failure to understand the limitations of reality. I guess like the child thinks that they're sort of omnipotent, and then gradually learns to sort of accommodate themselves to the way the world actually works. And I think that as a metaphor for what happened to lots of people on the left after the 2019 election is very powerful, because I guess I was at The World Transformed 2 months before that awful night when the exit poll dropped. And there were all these kind of panel discussions about what incredible transformative policies we're going to implement and what a Corbyn government is going to look like. And even though we had seen the polls and we were also aware of the formation of this new sort of impenetrable block of right-wing populism, and the threat that posed to a Labour Party that had sort of thrown its lot in with Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson, we could sort of see in one way like reality encroaching upon us, but in another way we were having these extraordinary discussions about abolishing Ofsted and nationalizing the heights of the economy. And you couldn't help but think that, that fantasy might become reality. And then I think what happened to a lot of people when they saw the exit poll was they realized, their fantasies were wrong and dangerous and had only set them up for this crushing disappointment. So then I guess that's where, enter the grown-up, who's
clean up the mess.
Absolutely, clean up the mess and, and constrain these childish fantasies, bring them down to earth, enforce the reality principle. And I think Starmer, it's possible to overstate the extent to which his campaign pitched left. Like, of course it did, to the extent that it could ease a socialist conscience on issues like kind of social welfare. But at the same time, it had this posture of kind of, I'm the professional, I'm the grown-up. And that was, I think deliberately drawing an implicit contrast with the sort of megaphone wielding militant, who had, had the right principles. His heart was in the right place, but at the end of the day, look what happened. So now we need, mature politics as the antidote to that upset.
Right. We need to be punished because we can't have nice things. Just a few more minutes before I'll turn to questions from the always brilliant Houseman's audience. Thank you all for your questions. Please drop any more in the chat box. On the subject of this is why we can't have nice things, I gotta mention, once I braced myself to read the book, and brilliantly written it is too, and I can't recommend it highly enough. For many on the left, some of the really sad bits. There are some revelations in the book about the left that will be painful to many. You suggest John McDonnell wasn't all we would have hoped. Was this surprising to you? Do you want to give out tissues to readers? It was very disappointing to read this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do hate to be the bearer of bad news. And in many ways, I have, a huge amount of respect for McDonnell as a titan of the British left, and as one of the few Labour MPs who has a genuine interest in kind of ideas, who formed links between the Labour leadership and a whole number of kind of radical think tanks and academics who gave it its sort of intellectual heft. But I think, fundamentally, although, I mean, the distinction to draw is between his intentions, which were good, and Starmer's, which were not. But McDonnell had, I think, the wrong analysis of the Brexit conjuncture. He was, on the one hand, completely fixated with the idea that the Labour membership were kind of hardcore Remainers who couldn't be convinced to any other position, who couldn't be convinced to compromise on the question of a second referendum. And he thought that if you wanted to keep the base kind of active and mobilized, you had to move in that direction. And then at the same time, and more importantly, in fact, McDonnell also thought that there was a real risk of mass defections from the parliamentary party to the formation that ultimately became Change UK. He thought that 70 to 80 MPs were going to leave, and then Labour would be this tiny kind of socialist rump, and it would be defeated by this new centrist party at the next election. And because he was so kind of spooked by that prospect, he then poured all his energy from 2018-19 onwards into joining with Starmer to shift the position of the party towards supporting a people's vote. And that meant that, he essentially joined with the people who were determined to discredit Corbyn, discredit the leadership. He joined with them when he should have been, in the trenches defending his comrades from this onslaught. And I think that, he was motivated by nothing other than wanting to elect a socialist government, whereas Starmer was motivated by something else. But I think he didn't reckon with the fact that as far as the membership goes, these people were, as Corbyn has said many times, first and foremost committed anti-racists. And insofar as they saw Brexit as a xenophobic project, they were going to oppose it. But if the leadership offered a compelling kind of internationalist leave program based on, forging trade relationships with progressive leaders in the global south, and based on rejecting the racism of Fortress Europe, which drowns people in the Mediterranean, I don't think that the Labour membership would have turned their backs on Corbyn. I think they would have come with him. And as for defections from the PLP, I think the fate of Change UK demonstrates how wrong McDonnell's position was. There is no popular constituency for the Labour right anymore. Change UK was nothing but a sort of media spectacle that then, was punctured on the slightest contact with reality. And there's nothing to say that, that would have been any different if more MPs had defected. I think it would have actually been good to have a clear out of MPs who were nothing but hostile to the leadership, and then to, replace them with committed socialists. So I think it was just those two pillars of his analysis that, led him towards this position where he was more interested in sort of supporting the ultimately quite cynical attempts of the People's Vote campaign to weaken the leadership than he was in strengthening it.
A lot of people found it hard to see clearly when the Waitrose warriors were on the move. So we've got loads of questions here. I'm going to reserve the right to ask my final killer question after we get through these great ones. Some of you have gone off piste, not followed party discipline, and put your questions into the chat. We'll be sending you a letter later. Let me lead with a question from a woman. Emma Randall Caprez. This should be a quick one to do. Thank you, Emma, for your question. Is the story that Starmer comes from a truly working class background correct or a distortion of the truth?
I think this may be one of the few things that Lord Ashcroft got right when he said that Starmer had kind of minorly embellished his working class credentials, but was in fact petty bourgeois. His father, often described as a tool maker, in fact was the registered owner of a tool making company.
Not quite the same thing.
Not quite the same thing. Although,
means of production.
That's true, though. There was a suggestion that it was like a very, very small tool making company that maybe only employed him and like occasionally a couple other people. So, I don't think, Starmer is either a kind of lifelong member of the elite or necessarily the sort of deeply deprived person who he made himself out to be.
Right. Let's go to the people who have obeyed discipline and put their questions into the box. Some Jameses. James Wilson's asking who his major political advisors and consultants are, and are there any Yanks among them, or Australians, we could ask. Give us the rogues gallery.
Good question. Well, I guess there was a big clear out of them following on from the catastrophic results in last year's local elections and the Hartlepool by-election. So previously, Starmer had imported a lot of the same staffers from his shadow Brexit secretary office. And lots of these people were quite kind of young and inexperienced, but they were very loyal to Starmer, and as he saw it, they had kind of really delivered during those years. So Ben Nunn was the most prominent among them, who was Starmer's communications director. But then I think there was a shift that happened when the party wasn't performing well, where Starmer felt like, the only people who had really proven themselves capable of sort of honing this strategy of, sort of crafting a message that resonates with the public were really the Blairite grandees. And that's when Peter Mandelson returned to the fold as an unofficial advisor and embarked on a big kind of sweeping policy review, which then yielded a number of like carbon copies of Blair era policies, including a sort of rehashed ASBO campaign, because the first one was so good that you just need another.
Get the band back together.
Absolutely. And now, his office, having been sort of purged of some of these previous advisors, is full of, every single person is a hard right factional appointment, most of whom at one time or another worked for Blair or Brown. There's Deborah Mattinson, who's the kind of polling guru who wrote a book called Beyond the Red Wall about how to craft a kind of, blue Labourite, socially conservative platform that will win back these lost heartlands. There's Sam White and Matthew Doyle, both of whom were, part of the New Labour project. And I think, these people, I just don't really have many new ideas, which is why so many of the policies emanating from the leader's office now are kind of reruns of previous ones, but also at the same time why, in a way, they come into their element when they're managing political scandals, which is, you know, something Blair and his aides were great at doing. A scandal gives them a chance to kind of personalize politics in a way that works very well for them, and also to appeal to, you know, the virtue of the British state against the bad apples and corrupting influences who need to be excised from it. So you can see that very clearly in the way that he's responding to Partygate. You know, there's the appeal to the kind of decent, honourable members on the opposite bench against the clown who's leading them. So I think, you know, the Blairites have their communicative strengths and weaknesses, and you can see the strengths shining through now. But I think when Partygate has evaporated or is no longer top of the headlines, I think like the vacuity of their program will become more apparent.
James Armstrong has asked, and this is something I think you touched on in a recent Novara article, what would you argue is the relationship between Starmerism and Blairism if Starmer's project is not simply a return to Blair?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, I think, well, for one thing, Blair was, you know, a committed kind of neoliberal and free marketeer, and I don't think that Starmer is. I think Starmer is very insecure whenever he's asked about fiscal policy, and there was that report about him being given kind of economics for beginners tutorials by Lord Falconer, because
you mentioned this in the book.
Yeah.
Who told you this, and did they chuckle when they told you?
This was actually this was reported in the Times, I think. So yeah, so I didn't hear it firsthand. But yeah, so I think you know, Blair's kind of zealous market reforms were a follow-up to Thatcherism, really. You know, kind of inheriting its framework, but really making the most of the end of history by presenting this quite, you know, hopeful program based on the one hand, yes, kind of selling off and marketizing all the parts of the state that were still left standing, but casting that as a kind of grand modernizing project that has a vibrant kind of cultural edge as well that will, you know, create a kind of cool Britannia settlement where,
and some sure start centers.
Absolutely, sure start centers. Yeah, the prejudices of the past will melt away, and everyone will confront one another as kind of equal actors in this sort of sphere of open and free market exchange. So I think, you know, Blair's kind of energy and dynamism came from that fundamental kind of belief in the free market. And then the authoritarian aspects of Blairism were kind of, in a way, secondary and designed to protect that basic principle, that basic kind of neoliberal principle. You know, that sort of beautiful sphere of exchange needed to be protected from any outsider that might threaten it. So whether that's someone kind of scrounging off the state, whether that's sort of an asylum seeker who comes from a culture that doesn't understand the virtues of the free market, or indeed a kind of rogue state like Iraq that needs to be sort of taught to conform to that liberal democratic norm. You know, the repressive and militarist elements of Blairism were sort of working in concert with its fiscal policies. Whereas I think the relationship with Starmerism is reversed in a way. I think Starmer is first and foremost a disciplinarian, a punisher of, you know, of dissidents in the party and of the activist left in general. And as a corollary of that, he's unwilling to sort of offer any kind of, you know, any even bland or tepid version of social democracy, because that would conjure up the memory of Corbynism, and that's what needs to be sort of forgotten and repressed. So I think, whereas in Blairism, discipline was a means to the end of protecting the market. In Starmerism, you have the kind of inverse relation where being a free marketeer is the means to the end of enforcing discipline.
Okay. Let's go to some great questions from Joe Skeeping. Did the leaders of the People's Vote campaign know exactly what they were doing?
That's a good question. There is that telling quote in the Pogren de Maguire book, I think, where one of them is asked, will people look back on your project as nothing but a catastrophic failure? And he says, no, because people will look back on us as the people who stopped Jeremy Corbyn from becoming Prime Minister. So, there is that, whether that's a kind of retrospective rewriting of their role, which tries to kind of, salvage something from it, is an open question. I think I looked more specifically, I suppose, at Starmer's sort of maneuvering to steer the party towards that position. And I don't think that Starmer himself, as the kind of standard bearer of the People's Vote campaign, was openly engaged in kind of sabotaging the party's electoral prospects and hoping that it would crash to defeat. I think he had two scenarios in mind when he was sort of promoting the cause of Remain. I think one of them was, yes, on the one hand, this might lead to a crushing defeat for Corbyn, and then I'll be in a prime position to take the reins. I think that was he was actually, there's sort of empirical evidence that he was thinking ahead to that scenario, in that he was meeting with people in the run-up to the election while others were sort of out on the doorsteps, and he was drumming up support for his prospective leadership bid. But I think also Starmer thought, if we happen to win and sort of just about edge into Downing Street, then we'll have been elected on this pledge to hold a people's vote. And it's going to be a huge blow to Corbyn's authority if the first thing he does as Prime Minister is negotiate a deal, put it to a public vote, and lose. They would be straight out. The media would go into sort of overdrive on seeing this as a sign of how moribund the Corbyn project was. And I think in that situation, Starmer also saw that there would be an opening quite soon into Corbyn's prime ministerial tenure. So I think you don't have to have a sort of conspiracist view of like active plans for sabotage to see how the situation was manipulated to the benefit of Starmer and his faction of the party.
To see that there were opportunities, however it went, which I'm sure someone like Alistair Campbell and his key role, would have seen. Got a great question from Philip Matasavage. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Something we've touched on already, but worth bringing up. Len, in a recent interview, Len McCluskey said he didn't know if Starmer was a babe in the woods, in the political woods, who'd been captured by the right, or a Machiavellian figure who'd actually believed in the politics he's now espousing. So I guess just to forward on from what you've said, what would your take on that be?
I would err more on the side of Machiavellian, though hoping that doesn't cast Starmer into kind of intelligent a light. I think, I think a close reading of his record at the CPS is enough to show that he does have a politics that might not amount to a sort of consistent ideological worldview. But I think Starmer was formed in a particular political tradition, which is, I think, fundamentally an outdated one, and one that doesn't have very much to offer. And so the impression of kind of vacancy, of being lost in the woods, of being an outsider who doesn't quite know what he's doing, I think is not a sign that Starmer doesn't have a clear politics. It's actually a symptom of that politics. Yeah, I think he's best understood as a leader in that way.
And so is it that rigidity that feeds into things like not liking being caught on the hop by an impertinent young person talking about the planet frying?
Yes, absolutely. I think you don't have to concede that Starmer has a politics isn't necessarily to claim that he's a good politician.
Right.
I contrast him at the end of the book to both Corbyn and to Blair, who, arrived at a particular historical moment and kind of had an answer to it. I don't think Starmer has an answer beyond kind of trying to forget or marginalize the legacy of Corbynism. But the impulse to do so, I think, comes from a particular political tradition, which can nonetheless be understood and contextualized.
Got a great question from Diane Pearson about Sir Keir. Does he really believe anti-Semitism is rampant in Labour, or is it a means of taking control?
I don't think he does believe that at all. And I think there are actually statements he made a few years ago under Corbyn's leadership that now, could bring sort of the wrath of the party's governance and legal unit down upon him. No, I think, this is a question on which the left have been far too willing to concede, given the sensitivities involved. But you can look at what the Home Affairs Select Committee said about anti-Semitism in the party. You can look at the detailed report commissioned by Lotto and then subsequently leaked. The empirical evidence for a sort of mass constituency of anti-Semites is non-existent, and if in the transition from Starmer using anti-Semitism as the issue on which he pegged his war on the left, there's a transition from that to then targeting these tiny insignificant Trotskyist grouplets, and I think the fact that he's switched from one to the other suggests that his initial line that he wasn't interested in a war with the Labour left, he was simply interested in dealing with anti-Semitism, that was always false. And the ease with which he's now openly targeting people who are deemed to be too left-wing just confirms that.
Got a great question from Roger Rees. In the wrong box, Roger. See me after. Does Oliver think that Starmer is, in effect, interested in turning Labour into a UK version of the Democratic Party, set in the context of a two-party consensual political system, as per the US?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I think there are people around him who are. I think particularly in David Evans's office, there are some people who have really imported a lot of, the kind of most vacuous parts of, democratic kind of neoliberal politics to Labour. And there are some people who work for the party who believe that the recent round of redundancies was kind of part of this campaign to turn Labour into less of a kind of, large political institution with a dedicated core of civil servant type employees and a mass membership, and make it a much more kind of slimmed down, nimble operation that is, just about kind of fighting elections. So this is like an almost presidential model that you're kind of moving towards. And you could see that also in the kind of deliberate disenfranchisement of so many members, the kind of very conscious drive.
Certainly slimming down.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. To get socialists to tear up their membership cards. I think that also, it in one way has the effect of like benefiting the leadership in NEC and CLP elections. So that's a plus. But at the same time, it also signals a broader shift towards this kind of, much slimmer political machine, which could be indeed, modeled on the Democratic Party. I think at the same time, though, it's maybe there are kind of very sort of ingrained traditions in the Labour Party that I think won't die away just because the structure changes. I think like that kind of, moral or sentimental socialism that I was talking about earlier, which is really an inheritance from sort of low church Protestant traditions in England, that has no American equivalent. And I think that will continue to be a very influential discourse in the Labour Party for years to come. So I think there are different backgrounds and therefore different trajectories. But yes, there's also a core of people who think that the Americans do everything right and we just need to emulate them.
Interestingly, one emulation isn't in Biden's gestures toward trade unions and gestures indeed toward Bernie Sanders, although things are very difficult for AOC and others. Bernie still has roles in government and significant ones.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, this is, rightly or wrongly, that's obviously the model that kind of McDonnell has been using to criticize Starmer, or to put pressure on him, saying, Biden is a centrist who's governing from the left, as it were, drawing on these new ideas and appointing, the kind of most prominent representatives of those ideas to key positions. Why is this not a model for the Labour Party? And I think that's a very valid question. I think that, a right-wing leadership would actually be more popular and more electorally successful if it did something along those lines. But I think Starmer is kind of feels too fragile and too insecure to have anyone of that political orientation anywhere near power in the party.
Maybe we could ask his tens and tens of thousands of Twitter followers about it. I was hoping someone would raise this question. Two people have, someone who is appropriately anonymous and the other one, Andy Simons. Some questions about our favorite after dinner club. Is there a link with Starmer's membership of the Trilateral Commission and his ambition to be leader? Our anonymous friend asks, and Andy asks if Starmer has actually publicized his invite to join the Trilateral Commission. If so, maybe his elders might continue to be his mentors. Any goss?
I'm afraid not much goss on that. In the book itself, it's regrettably consigned to a footnote. But, yes, Starmer, as part of his ascent to venerated Knight of the Realm, also joined this elite institution, the Trilateral Commission, which famously released a sort of report that claimed that there was an excess of democracy in developed countries that was a regressive force that was stopping them from properly kind of modernizing. And there are clear links between that and I think Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party. And, if you want to go there also, his an anti-democratic approach to the Brexit question as well. So yes, I'm sure there are links. There's very little publicly available about Starmer's relationship with the Trilateral Commission. There are a few kind of trilateral events that he attended and spoke at, but I'm afraid you will have to wait for the sequel to the Starmer Project, which unfortunately won't be written by me. So
we've got about another quarter of an hour and lots more great questions, some from repeat offenders here. So I'll go back to James Wilson. Is it possibly, when we were talking about, Starmer being the grown-up in the room and all that, is it possibly more about the perception of techno-competence than bringing in the grown-up? I don't know, is he good with his phone? I'm not really sure what James, techno-competence?
Techno-competence, certainly. I mean, this is something that if one wants to understand, Labour Party politics, I would really encourage everyone to read the essay, The Nature of the Labour Party by Tom Nairn, written in the 60s and relevant as ever. And it tries to kind of identify the central tendencies in the party. Some of which have changed and adapted since the 60s, but one that he draws out is a kind of technicism, is what he calls it, managerial competency as a virtue that the leadership has always had to display. And he sets that alongside a certain kind of like authentocracy as well. Like it's the contradiction of kind of right-wing Labour Party politics is that on the one hand, it's incredibly technocratic and sort of depoliticizing and sees policy questions merely as kind of problems that need solving rather than interests that are sort of conflicting with one another. But as well as being, technicist, it also then pitches itself to this kind of construct of like the ordinary person, the authentic Labour voter. And it tries on the one hand to have this sort of populist appeal, sort of very performatively rooting itself in the values of the everyday person, which are obviously all the most like abhorrent, racist, nationalist tropes you can possibly imagine. And then, with the other hand, sort of insulating policymaking from any kind of sense of class interest by presenting it in purely neutral terms as a kind of technical matter for elites. And I think that combination, which Nairn identified many decades ago, is a great encapsulation of Starmer's politics and leadership.
How do you solve a problem like society? Hang on, I've got my slide rule. Well, come out of the machine. James Wilson, how important was or have been voters' views about Brexit, my favorite, and in particular immigration in the fall of Corbyn and the rise of the politics that could enable or produce a Starmer? Is it all about that terrible woman, as Gordon Brown said, how dare she? Is it about the mug? Is that it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is one of the questions that I try to address directly in the book. There's the long chapter that kind of follows very closely the twists and turns of the Brexit narrative. But then after that, it kind of zooms out to talk about the various interpretations of the election loss. And one of the most prominent interpretations is, obviously that there was a kind of hardcore of Brexiteers who could never have been won over in the first place to Corbyn's program because they were so inveterately, so racist, so attached to, on the one hand, some kind of faded imperial grandeur, and on the other to their comfortable semi-detached house, whose price they want to protect against any kind of radical government or redistributive policy. So, there's this line about kind of the typical red wall voter, which sees them as, entirely beyond the pale for social democratic politics. And I'm sort of skeptical of that. I think that it's hard to square that perception with the 2017 result, where it was,
right, you challenge this in the book.
Yeah. It was in those, very demographics that Labour enjoyed a surge in the vote share, often not a massive one, but enough to win seats from the Tories that were, incredibly decisive in the composition of Parliament as a whole. And moreover, I think that the impulse that the Brexit vote expressed was more indeterminate than people necessarily think. It was about taking back control, and it was about the reason that most people gave in surveys for voting for Brexit was the principle that decisions about the UK should be made in the UK. So I think those two phrases, this like principle of sovereignty and the imperative to take back control, are quite kind of amorphous propositions. And I don't think it was impossible, and I think 2017 was a partial demonstration of this, that Labour could have offered those people something which the Tories couldn't. So yeah, I'm for that reason even more incensed at the turn towards a second referendum. I mean, obviously, if you were never going to win those people in the first place, then your Brexit policy is irrelevant. But I have to say, I don't think it was.
Right. Got time for a couple more things. One, before I go into Joe Skeeping's question, let me just preface it with the careful notes I made earlier. So in this marvelous book, for those of you who've just joined us, which is out now, at the very end, there's 3.5 pages of things that tell us what we can do to have some hope, what we can do on the left beyond Westminster, so to build a better world, and find reasons for optimism. Sharon Graham's election at Unite, upstart unions IWGB and UVW, tenants groups like Acorn, Sisters Uncut, We Own It, Palestine Solidarity Campaign and BDS, the Peace and Justice Project, also known as the Corbyn Project, Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, Stop the War, Tribune, Novara, The World Transformed, and apparently there are some radical academics as well. So that's 3.5 pages, and it comes after 191 pages. Joe asks, what do you think disillusioned Labour Party members or ex-members should do now? I hope that wasn't a spoiler, by the way.
This is the perennial question, which I have to say, I just am so averse to the kind of moralizing tone of the debates about whether people should keep their membership cards or relinquish them. And, I don't think that I have any authority to tell people what they should do about preserving their membership or otherwise. I also think it's that removing all the kind of ethical injunctions from that question would be very helpful, and instead seeing it as a purely kind of strategic matter. But I guess what I try to do at the end of the book is just show how, regardless of whether one is inside or outside the party, there are all these initiatives and institutions of the British left which are actually, I think, in a way stronger now than they were at the outset of the Corbyn experiment. And, whether or not we're going to have another left-wing Labour leader, the parliamentary left, which I think, will continue to exist in some form, needs to rely on this broader infrastructure. And I guess the point I try to make, and Karen gave us a sense of it there in sort of running through that list, is that at the moment, many of these campaigns are very kind of disconnected and disjointed, and you can present them as a list, but the way they sort of interlink is sometimes unclear. So my very modest plea is just for sort of more collaboration between these different elements, and extending that collaboration to the Socialist Campaign Group as well, who remain a useful outpost in a very hostile environment. One of my sources for the book, who's quoted in it, James Schneider, has a book coming out soon called Our Block, also from Verso, where he proposes, and I think it's really one of the most concrete articulations of what the British left could do to have more of a sort of public voice. He proposes a sort of tripartite alliance between the left-led trade unions, the Socialist Campaign Group, and Momentum. And if those left-wing MPs are going to sort of have any means of defending themselves from the leadership, I think they'll need organizations like that at their side. And those organizations in turn, I think, will feed into this broader movement that you just sort of gave us a rundown of, Karen.
The mention of momentum, of course, it depends which momentum we're talking about, and all the issues around that. I suppose some people who feel disillusioned would say, yes, I wanted to be involved in other things. I went to Momentum. That didn't always feel great. Wasn't sure who was running the show or who for. And similarly, talking about maybe other smaller political parties. It's hard not to mourn the prospect of, yes, all these other things are great, but the prospect of actually having a transformative government, sometimes what's left, the 3.5-page list, without denigrating any of those organizations, it's a whole nother thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very true. I'm certainly not I am a former Trotskyist, but as a former Trotskyist, I know what it's like to sit in the basement of pubs with 12 people talking about the exceedingly distant prospect of administering the state and all the sort of incredibly petty factional wars that we're obliged to have in between now and then. I know what that's like and don't want to return to those dark days. But can there be any prospect of a social democratic government, not least a socialist one, before there's a real sort of unsparing kind of account of what went wrong during the Corbyn period and a reckoning with how dire the situation is now? I think resisting consolation is very painful, but it is also a duty for leftists of any stripe.
We're almost finished. Thank you so much. I was going to end with my killer question, but it's not very much fun. So maybe you could feed it into something that ends like, I don't know, with something upbeat, maybe a little favorite quote, a song, something we can go home with with some hope in our hearts. I was going to ask you, I mean, obviously we know Rachel Reeves would very much like Sir Keir Starmer to be the next prime minister, but let's be realistic. There are millions of people around the country who also would like him to be the next prime minister. Can you say really briefly what kind of prime minister you think he will be? And then could you end with something nice?
Yeah, those two questions don't necessarily naturally fit together, but I think as a prime minister, it would be hard to see Starmer repealing the kind of authoritarian legislation that's been the cornerstone of this Tory government. I guess people don't realize that, for example, the policing bill that passed in the Lords, when was it, yesterday, was initially kind of lobbied for by Starmer. Wow. He had his Shadow Home Secretary go and address the Police Federation and say, we're in full support of any bill that gives you enhanced powers to crack down on, nuisances and protests. Obviously, then he sort of later resigned from that position. But I think the Starmerite posture of sort of endless compromise and concession to the Murdoch press, among others, will not stop at the point that Starmer becomes prime minister. There is no terminus to that. And if it's not necessary to win an election to get into power, it will be necessary to win the next election to stay in power. So in that sense, I don't see all that much hope for a Starmer prime ministership.
So tell us something that does give you hope, other than that you've finished this book and you don't have to write the sequel.
Oh yeah, that's all I can think about right now. If I wasn't forced to then do these publicity events, yeah.
All right, besides the 3.5 pages, what was the last thing, and James Schneider's idea about our blog, what was the last thing you came across that made you feel good?
Well, I suppose going to some of those Kill the Bill demos did genuinely feel like, it became a kind of trope and maybe a defeatist trope of that movement that, even if the bill passed, it would be unenforceable. But I think there was a real sense of that at those demos. And one that was kind of very like intergenerational, as lots of street protests are, like bringing together young sort of XR type people and like people who look and dress like Jeremy Corbyn. And I felt there was on lots of those demos a kind of like libertine spirit that it would be hard to imagine, being sort of snuffed out even by the most aggressive legislation, whether it comes from Johnson or from Starmer. I think so both, that feeding into forms of kind of street level resistance and also into, a kind of cultural ferment is a hopeful thing. Sort of popular culture under Thatcher, for example, was incredibly lively and vibrant and provided, such a contrast to what was going on at the heart of government. And I think it's entirely possible that something similar will emerge in the coming years, even if there is no resurgence of the Labour left.
Let's hope so, comrade. So Oliver Eagleton, thank you for joining us. Here's my final pack shot, The Starmer Project from Verso Books. It's out now. You can get it at Houseman's, either online or in our wonderful, wonderful shop in King's Cross. Thanks for spending your almost launch night with us. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Thanks everyone who's joined us tonight. Solidarity.